In the latest incident that is sparking outrage across the Muslim world, the leader of an anti-Muslim hate group has desecrated a copy of the Quran in front of the Turkish embassy in the Netherlands. The group's leader, under police protection, also ripped the Quran outside other embassies, including Pakistan and Indonesia. Under Dutch law, desecrating the Quran is protected by freedom of speech. This year, several European countries have seen a spate of Quran burnings, which sparked riots and protests across the Muslim world. Sweden, which saw several incidents this year, has been criticized by Muslim leaders for allowing such provocative acts to take place. During his speech to the UN General Assembly last week in New York, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan condemned the rise of Islamophobia and the Quran burnings across Europe, calling them a new form of racism that incites hate speech against Muslims. And to further discuss the latest desecration against the Quran in Europe, joining me now is Amina Sharif. She is a lecturer at Goldsmiths, University of London. And from Berkeley, California is Hatem Bazian. He is the president at the International Islamophobia Studies and Research Association. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. Amina, what do you make of the latest Quran desecration in the Netherlands, and how prevalent are these anti-Muslim groups in Europe? Are they growing in popularity?
So my perspective on the Quran burnings in Europe that I would like to highlight is that they are growing in frequency. But even though they are growing in frequency in terms of the number of incidences that we're seeing, I think it's important to make note that the racism that is driving this Quran burning is hardly new. Right? We know that the individuals who are behind the Quran burnings often belong to far-right groups, and these far-right groups have been mobilizing for over 2 decades now on an anti-Islam agenda. And this anti-Islam agenda, sorry.
So Hatem, how concerned should Muslims be across Europe amid rising cases of Islamophobia, and what could they do to confront such hate crimes within their host countries?
Well, thank you for having me. Muslims should be concerned. We're almost 60 years removed from the Second World War and the mass genocide that's been committed against the Jewish population and others, but also we have the Bosnian genocide in the 1992 to 95. So Europe, despite what it actually puts out, that it is a tolerant place, it has always been a place where minorities and religious communities that are non-Christians have always faced genocidal tendencies and, in essence, inability to live within the confines of Europe. So I would say the Muslims should be concerned. And I do think that Muslim world should pay attention to the development that has been taking place within the European continent.
So, Amina, what do you think, and what do you make of the Muslim world's reaction to these latest attacks on the Quran?
The reaction has to be understood in relation to how Muslim people understand the Quran. You know, the Quran is something that is very sacred to Muslim people, and burning the Quran and authorizing the burning of the Quran, which we saw take place by the Swedish courts, touches Muslim sensibilities at a very deep level. So I think that has to be said first when we evaluate Muslim response to the Quran burnings. Now, the second question is, you know, what does it take to challenge anti-Muslim racism? Is it, of course, we know that we need to do more than simply, you know, protest Quran burnings, but anti-Muslim racism is something that is institutionalized. It is something that has been developing over the past 2 decades now, and we need to think about who is going to be sort of leading this challenge against anti-Muslim racism and where it is going to take place from as well.
So, Hatem, the leader of this anti-Muslim Pedagogy movement in the Netherlands, Welt, desecrated the copies of the Quran in front of the embassies of Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Denmark. What's the ulterior motive behind this? I mean, what does he want to achieve, really?
I think this has been within the European leadership couched as a freedom of expression or supporting freedom of expression and free speech. But freedom of expression, in essence, it is trying to make an argument. And the question is, what arguments are being made by desecrating the Quran? There is no argument that is being made. Even if you want to say that you want to express anti-religious sentiments, the Muslims do not have power base. Often when these protests take place, you are trying to take a statement or a position against an existing power. The Muslims across Europe are lacking power. They're minority, marginalized. I see it as a form. One is a form of taunting the community, but the second, Europe is going through this political transformation. In essence, you have books like the Grand Replacement, the Eurabia thesis that tries to construct a solidarity within the European white majority by actually identifying the demonized other. So I put the burning of the Quran in the same way that the KKK, the racists in America, targeted black churches as a site of collective lynching and a site of collective violence toward the black minority. So the burning of the Quran is an act of taunting, is an act of collective lynching in the public square directed at the Muslim population. And I think we need to speak of it in the same lens, rather than actually accept the European frame that this is a freedom of expression and free speech.
So, Amina, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan addressed the UNGA last week about the growing tide of Islamophobia. What do you think? I mean, could the UN be an effective platform for tackling Islamophobia?
You know, I think it's very important for Muslim leaders and leaders of other faiths or no faiths at all to take a stand against anti-Muslim racism. But what I think is important is that we need to think about what it takes to address anti-Muslim racism in Europe and beyond. And we need to think about who should be leading this challenge and where, as I mentioned previously. Anti-Muslim racism in Europe is this political project that is exposing Muslim people to slow death, essentially, when they are excluded from education, employment, decent housing, healthcare, and when they're driven to live in extreme conditions of poverty. So anti-Muslim racism is also, devitalizing Muslim people as believers. And we can see this with, hijab bans and abaya bans in various political contexts. So I think we need to understand that what is at stake here is the survival of Muslim populations and the survival of Muslim people as believers. And so given what is at stake here with anti-Muslim racism, we need to really think about who needs to be driving this struggle against anti-Muslim racism. And if it's really going to be, or if it really should be led by institutions that historically have been involved in systems of racism and oppression.
So, Hatem, attacks against Quran and many other holy books are not still considered illegal in many countries across Europe. Could this change since Denmark is now considering banning protests involving burning of the Quran or other religious texts? And could Sweden and now the Netherlands follow suit?
I think it depends on the type of political pressure that should be mounted and could be mounted in partnership between Muslim leadership across the Muslim world, whether Turkey, Malaysia, Pakistan, Qatar, and other countries on the European system in order to actually put restrictions. I remind people that actually there are restrictions that are present in European countries on a number of issues, including any type of activities that taunts and target the Jewish community, denials of the Holocaust. So there are restrictions. So this notion that Europe has an open-ended free speech and freedom of expression really has to be challenged. So I do call for Muslim countries' leadership to put the needed pressure on European countries to create legal restrictions. I do also think that the United Nations step by declaring the International Day on Recognition of Islamophobia on March 15, that came as a result of work by Muslim countries, is very vital to mobilize civil society in partnership in such a way that we would highlight and continue to push for protections, which I think falls under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I do think we have remedies, but I do urge individuals and leadership from across the Muslim world to actually mobilize their forces in order to make sure that the barriers and the legal restrictions are placed in there to protect Muslim sensibility and the sacredness of their text and the sacredness of the Quran in that way.
All right, Amina and Hatem, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.